our habit. We've got a terrific panel. Of course, Janet could not be here to do her presentation. She was also to participate on our panel this morning, so she will not be able to be here. But that being said, we still have a terrific panel. We have Jordan Kislear, who is an engineer in the Office of Clean Coal and Carbon Management at DOE. Quin, Shea, who you just heard from EEI. Richard Lopriore, who is here from PSEG. One cheer. Frank Wozeliak, who is the president and CEO of Columbia Power, and Frank, I probably butchered your name, so I apologize in advance for that. Jerry Purvis, who is the director of environmental affairs for East Kentucky Power Corporation, and John Quackenbush, who is the chairman, as you know, of the Michigan Public Service Commission, and who we heard from earlier this morning. I think everyone has a chair. I will ask our panelists, when you answer questions, please pull the mic up nice and close, otherwise we're not going to be able to hear you, or we're going to hear reverb, and that doesn't work well for the guys running the soundboard or for anybody that's trying to hear what you have to say. So we have, much like our presentations this morning, we divided the time roughly in half. I have some questions that I prepared that would hopefully stimulate some discussion. All the panelists know what those questions are, so they could be prepared for what they might hear from me. No one is required to answer any questions. These are all my disclaimers, not theirs. No one's required to answer every question, although certainly they are free to do so if they want to. If they would elect not to, they can simply pass and not have to engage in the conversation. I know that some have issues that are more important or ones that they would like to convey messages to you on, and others that maybe just don't rise to the level of warranting a comment, and certainly we would defer to them on what that might be. So with those ground rules in effect, I'll start with our first question, which won't surprise you in that it revolves around 111D, as has a good bit of our morning, either directly or indirectly. And my first question, and I'll pitch it to whomever would like to take the first swing, and then all of you can chime in as you feel would be appropriate. But 111D's proposal from EPA is pretty far-reaching and pretty broad. We've heard a little bit about how it may impact utilities and power generators in states who are going to need to respond and ensure compliance. And we've heard from some of our panelists this morning, but I guess I'd like to get a perspective from the other members of our panel. How do you see that taking place? How might it impact the utilities generally, power generators in different markets? Some are vertically integrated, others are competitive merchant generators who can't pass the costs on to ratepayers, and other unique situations involving membership in an RTO or an ISO or to not. And so how do you see that taking place in a very broad sense as we look at, it's been all of 2 weeks since the 111D rule was published, or put out for comment, I should say. And I think the more we read it, Quin has done a good job of noting that there's things that people thought they knew that maybe aren't what they turned out to be, and there's work to be done. So kind of give us a general perspective from across the industries that you represent, the regulatory community and others, about where we are. So with that, feel free to jump in, whoever would like to go first. Or we can use the Russian draft system, either way, whichever way you'd like to do it. Rich, it looks like you are dying to answer, so I'm going to ask you if you'd like to go first. That'd be great.
That's the Russian system, is that it? First of all, I love attorneys, so Quin, really appreciate you being here.
Moderator's glad to hear that as well.
Well, for us, we've got some things that we have to resolve. I do believe Quin was right. It could have come out entirely different, I think, with the intervention in helping get this rule the way it is, I think, was a good job on everybody's part. For us, we're concerned with a rate versus a tonnage, and we'll be looking at a hearing coming up in the near future that will take a look at seeing if we can get the goal setting so it's appropriate and it's meaningful and it helps versus having unintended consequences. So that's one area. We're also looking at probably reinstating RGGI as a solution. Connecticut and New York maintained RGGI, and that'll be one of the prime tools of them to be able to meet the 111D. So we'll consider going back and seeing how we can reinstate that and put that into its place. The goals could, if they went the way they could go, it could actually shut down all our coal operations in the state in order to meet the the state requirements. So the fact that the states have a lot to say in terms, and we can work with the states, and once we get through that, I think is something that is doable for us. Does that answer your question?
That's a great start. Frank?
I was going to say it's Frank Wszelaki from Columbia Power Corporation, British Columbia. Spent a lot of years in the U.S., about 30 years plus, working primarily with DTE Energy and NiSource. But when I saw the rule come out, the interesting thing that I recognized was it's states having to work within their utility structures to ensure that you comply, which will be interesting to see how the larger utilities will interact with maybe some of the smaller players and how that'll end up panning its way out. In Canada, it's based on each facility and the facility's ability to reduce their emissions, and that's why a lot of the things that have happened from Quebec through Ontario and moving across to the West Coast, changes have occurred. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I noticed one other thing about that ruling, I think, and maybe some of the experts who are closer to it can answer the question. One of the things that we're looking at was reduction in the competition of wholesale energy in the market, and I think in the U.S. isn't the percentage that they're thinking about is only about 2% within that dollar figure. I don't know, Quinn, if you would know. But I just thought that was kind of interesting. Some of the things they're going after that some of the RTOs and some of the others would have to deal with. The percentages aren't that. As a CEO, do you look at the financials? Don't look as compelling as they would in other areas. That's just what I noticed. So just the initial scan of the document.
Jordan?
So I'm one of the people who hasn't spoken yet. I'm Jordan Kislear of the U.S. Department of Energy. I do a lot of outreach between our office, which is now the Office of Clean Coal and Carbon Management, which includes carbon capture and storage, not only for coal plants, but also for industrial and for gas plants. But anyways, I do a lot of outreach with EPA. So this morning there was a question from a gentleman with Great Lakes Solutions about what was the engagement with the RTOs and ISOs. And I was involved in a lot of those discussions where PJM and MISO and those folks came into DOE and spoke with us and then said, oh, and by the way, we're going across the mall and we're talking with EPA. And there were a number of proposals. Great River Energy came out and said, hey, we want to use the ISOs as a balancing authority. But a keen observer who reads through the rules will notice that there's about 2 paragraphs on system reliability that says it'll work itself out naturally. So I think that's something that's going to be really important to see when we start looking at the state plans, is how the ISOs and RTOs react to it, especially on how they review it and whether they're able to come in and say, wait a minute, this state plan has major reliability impacts that you didn't consider. Not only that, the state plans have to get through the House legislature, through both the House and the Senate, and then they have to be signed by the governor. And I think if you look at the RGGI approach, all of the RGGI states had to sign and ratify the exact same law. So trying to get that through, at least in a multi-state approach, and doing that in 2 years, maybe 3 years, is going to be a very, very challenging thing to do, especially with the number of special interests that are coming out on both sides of the aisle saying, yes, we like it, or no, we don't like it. So that's certainly something to watch.
Quinn?
All right. Just a couple of footnotes. First, it's sort of obvious I didn't mention this rule is going to be published tomorrow, so that starts the clock. We've been on borrowed time right now, sort of kvetching around with each other in EPA, but tomorrow the 120-day clock starts. Second thing, this has been mentioned, but it's hugely important. Over the next couple of months, if you're not already doing it, it's vitally important. Investor-owned utilities, co-ops, communities, work together, work with your state people, go in and talk to EPA collectively on behalf of your state. No divide and conquer. It's very important that you do this. There's a couple of fairness issues here I want to mention. One, this didn't come out, but this is sort of an analogy to Casper. There are going to be places where it's going to be unclear who's going to get credit for some of these transactions on a transboundary situation. Very important that you're working with your state if you think that you're owed something and not your sister state. One item that I do want to flag also for the state people in the room, it's a negative, and There will be efforts, I will project, in the coming months, where in individual states, non-IOU electric sector folks will probably be talking about burden shifting and saying, oh, we can't do that. You ought to make the IOUs do our share too. I'm sorry, it's a fact. I'm here to represent the IOUs. That's going to happen, and we're not going to put up with that. The couple of positives, changes to state targets. Gina has made it very clear that you've got these 48 state targets. She's already signaled some bend. If they got them wrong, if you're able to work with your state and your sister companies and demonstrate they got your target wrong, they are amenable to those changes. That's hugely important. They're not saying no. They've already signaled that they're going to change on some of the nuclear numbers. That's good. And the biomass rules pending. That'll give some more meat on what we can get there. So just a couple of additional points.
Great. Thank you. Jerry?
First of all, I appreciate being on the panel today. Just wanted to highlight a few things to get the audience to think about as they develop their questions. Appreciate what Quin had said earlier in his talk and highlighting how the industry is changing and the composition of the industry. Essentially, East Kentucky Power, whom I represent today, is a cooperative, and we have some munis in the audience. One of the biggest difference, folks, going into this rule, and there will be winners and losers, is that the business models for IOUs is much different than a cooperative and a muni. Our shareholder is the customer. Let me say it again. Our shareholder is the customer, whereas the IOU's customers are not necessarily their shareholders, so their business model's different. And so any capital improvements that IOUs make is a detriment to the shareholder, where ours is one and the same. Now, what does all that mean? What that means is that, IOUs will take a look at this rule as many rules, and they will pass on through a regulated community the cost of the rule, whereas our cost is passed on to our member cooperative or our end consumer. So our largest concern as a cooperative and munis alike is the end consumer. We will definitely have winners and losers, meaning as there's a shift from coal to natural gas, there will be potentially stranded assets. The bulk market, power market, will be redispatched with this new environmental constraint, and there will be consumers that have to pay quite a bit more. So we are highly concerned with rates versus a mass-based system. In Kentucky, that may be our only way to survive. You can't run a coal unit at 1,796 pounds per megawatt hour. Can't do it. So much as the president of PSEG said, some coal units are gone. So let's make no mistake about this. Been on the interpretation of the rule, and then the D.C. Circuit and who knows, the Supreme Court. There's definitely going to be winners and losers. So Kentucky will be redispatched. Coal, remaining useful life, that will be another area. That's a big one. There are a lot of coal units that actually have been built in the 2000s. So how long will they be depreciated? Will the consumer pay twice? Will those units be shut down as they pay for the new natural gas units? Big concerns, especially in Kentucky, where 49% of the folks of our customers are less than $25,000 a year. It's a high concern. So let's not candy coat this. I don't know many people in this room that make $25,000 a year. They'll suffer. So some of the environmental justice is actually going to harm those consumers. Next item. And this doesn't matter what company you represent. 70 gigawatts are coming offline in 2016, 2017. We just made it through the polar vortex. And while RTOs and gas pipeline companies, I went to the natural gas power generation conference, USA, just a few weeks ago. They said, oh, we've got plenty of natural gas, plenty pipe. We can build CTs as fast as you can permit them. And, if you've got 2 pipelines in your backyard, you're in good shape. Most of us don't have that. So you go through the polar vortex, I'd be highly concerned. Do you have enough natural gas supply? because there are only 320 gigawatts in the country, and 70 of them are going bye-bye in 2016. Something to think about. EPA wrote that 5.5 gigawatts of nuclear are coming on. Well, 70 gigawatts of coal is going away. So, you know, it is a predicament. Let's not candy coat it. Let's think about this. And I do salute Quin in saying we've got to come together, co-ops, munis, IOUs, to deal with this. This could be a bulk electric market energy crisis, right? 70 going away. And this is Jerry Purvis's personal opinion, not East Kentucky Power. But 70 gigawatts going away in 2 or 3 years. How do you replace that? There will be winners and losers. Can we get it permitted fast enough? Are there enough natural gas pipelines? Is enough pipe out there in the ground right now? Everything you read is, I don't want it in my backyard. So, you know, how are we gonna build new gas pipelines and have enough structure and storage to supply the future? We have 15 years to do it. And guess what? We're all going to be doing it. So the price of the capital equipment goes up, right, as supply drops off. Natural gas prices are very volatile. They always have been. That's nothing new. And coal, based on our power supply VP, coal has always set the price for everyone else by which to follow, because it sets the floor. So now if you remove the floor and the pricing of coal, what's natural gas and the oil boys going to do? So, not trying to paint a doomsday approach here, just trying to get a few facts out on the floor, just to think about, contemplate, obviously participate in rulemaking. It's important to get the facts out. It's important to be courageous, but factual and truthful, and recognizing what's going to happen. So, what's in, what's out, winners and losers, participate in this rulemaking. It's a big deal for our country. It's a big deal for your states. Yes, sir.
John?
Yeah, I'd just like to add about a comment about the multi-state approach. You know, as representing the state, you know, we and all the rest of the states are keenly focused on what does it mean for us. So we're pouring through the rules and figuring out. But given the uncertainties in there that, you know, we don't know about, there's different ways to interpret. None of us, I think, will be totally certain, even if we can interpret the rules and say, look, we can probably do this on our own. I think it's going to be important to be engaged in a multi-state conversation, because even if you think you can, you know, the interpretation may come out differently, or potentially the final rule may read differently than the proposed rule. So I think there'll be a lot of engagement, a lot of discussion amongst states. And, you know, there was a little bit of comment about, you know, maybe an RTO, a group of states and an RTO could join together. That's certainly possible. But there's unlimited bedfellows, so to speak, to borrow Quin's phrase. You know, I heard an EPA representative speak last week about it, and she used the example that, you know, maybe the state of Florida and the state of Washington, as far-flung as they are geographically, they could declare themselves a region for purposes of this. So I think there'll be a lot of interesting combinations of multi-state teams, so to speak.
Great, thank you. I have now learned my first lesson of moderating. Ask a more specific question, since we have chewed up a good 20 minutes of our time. So I'll try and combine a couple of questions in hopes that we can get some additional thoughts from you. And then if you're starting to formulate questions, we're probably one answer away from having questions from the floor. So you've all mentioned things that kind of hit on a common theme that I had thought about as things we would want to talk about today, which is, are the rules, and Quin's chart comes to mind, which was the 20 or so rules that are out there that are on the minds of the CEOs, but certainly in light of 111D. Are the rules jeopardizing the stability of the grid by forcing too rapid a switch of fuel sources, I guess is part A. And part B, I think, comes to really the question of, are the utilities, co-ops, munis, and others nimble enough to meet with the timelines that are in place and are able to do so in a way that's economically viable for ratepayers who, in my former role and in John's role, ultimately are the ones that have to pass those costs on.
The same rotation?
However you want to do it.
Well, first of all, I agree that the rule is going to have different impacts in the different regions. In PSEG, we have quite a diverse fuel mix in our generation area, so it offers us some flexibilities. But nonetheless, if you look at the next 2 years, it takes, to my knowledge, it takes at least 26 months to maybe 3 years to build a combined cycle plant. In those areas where we would like to build one, there is gas problems during the polar vortex. If we didn't have our coal operation up in New England, it's very likely they would have had some serious demand problems up there during that 2.5 months that existed, where gas prices went as high as $100 an MBTU. Coal became economical. It's not economical in the normal operations, neither in New Jersey nor in New England. So I see a lot of problems in keeping the lights on over the next 2 years. And I've heard 70 gigawatts, I've heard 35 gigawatts, I've heard 50 gigawatts. I'm going to take your number as being correct. It's large, and it's large enough where it's going to have an impact. And you can't recover that in the next 2 years from my knowledge of the business. So, for us, we got the diversity. That's going to help us with natural gas. However, our coal operations is important to us. And if you saw my coal piles right now, you'd see 90 effective full power days on a coal pile with the pro mods going forward. I won't burn that coal in 6 years based on the projections that I have. Having problems with coal delivery, transportation cost, all kinds of things are coming in to impact the economic viability of being a coal generator. And then later on, interesting enough, with the combined cycle gas, you want to build them, but that's coming under a lot of fire too, in terms of getting them permitted and things like that, because they're carbon emitters. And people don't want to see, even though gas is cleaner, there is issues with the carbon. So sorry to be long-winded.
Quinn?
2 data points for folks. Obviously, no one has a crystal ball, so we don't know what the potential reliability impacts will be, particularly regionally, which is what matters. But 2 things I think this group would be interested in. First, I am worried about sort of the end of this decade and the early part of the next decade, insofar that I've been looking at some of the studies that have been done by the RTOs of late, and what it struck me is they're looking at, PGM's looking at potential shortfalls based on sort of a post-MATS landscape. But these analyses do not include 111D. That's the problem. So you have to actually add that in. So when you're working with your states, when you're working with your RTOs, please make that connection, do that analysis. The second thing I think that will be of interest to you, we had a very good dialogue. Something that helped the MATS rule was the close relationship that was built between individual FERC commissioners, NARUC, staff, and the commissioners, and Gina McCarthy and her team on the MATS. That is sunsetted. We have taken steps right now at the request of our CEOs to sort of approach those 3 and reinvigorate that process to focus on 111D. Because no matter what EPA is saying publicly, the level of dialogue with the economic regulators has been deficient. That can be fixed, so we're going to reconstitute that sort of 3-way dialogue.
There was just Wszelaki, a study done by the Canadian Electrical Association. And if you get a chance, and I've got the book with me here, it's called Vision 2050. And I know this goes out to 2030. It has the same sort of elements in there that the Canadians talk about, because we do, share the border and the collaboration across the border. But when the question's around transmission, you have to ask yourself, is it already existing in the pole? Is it steel poles? Is it wood poles? or is it equipment you're going to install that goes to a new place, like a gas plant? What we've found out is, yes, you have the feds that are out there, and also within the provinces, people that'll slow you down, but transmission lines are very difficult to build, no matter where you go. It could be anything from the environmental studies that you have to perform to the landowners that you have to work with to get through, and then you got to build the thing. So when I look at transmission, and I look at the U.S. also, because I, still live in the U.S. too, the transmission systems are going to be real critical, and that's one of the key things you'll see in the Vision 2050 is that transmission. You can have the power. I was told one time by a CEO I really admire, you can run one of the greatest power plants, Frank, unless I can get it to the customer, it doesn't do me a whole hell of a lot of good. So, you got to have that piece of the pie. So.
All right, we'll take questions from the floor. And if you don't ask questions, I've got other ones, but I want to make sure that we engage the audience. So if you just raise your hands, there's a mic that's going around if you have a question for any one of the panelists. All right, I see you're pondering your question, so I'm going to start out with another one. The topic of energy efficiency as part of the 111D building block was up, but also Rich and I were talking a little bit about demand response. How do you see those two pieces of the puzzle fitting together on, can it help solve some of the reliability concerns? Is it going to be a useful tool, or how useful a tool do you think it might be as we look at compliance with 111D, or just in general about how systems are changing? If you read the trade press, things are working differently, distributed generation and some of the other issues. Demand response is also in that same, I think, bowl of fruit, and there's been some recent court decisions that have addressed where FERC is at on some of those issues. So curious from your points of view, not just Rich, but the entire panel, about where energy efficiency and demand response may fit into this larger puzzle.
Well, I think demand response, it's a good thing. I think as long as it's economically justified, I think it needs to be on an even playing field with other generators. I think that exemptions in emissions and those kinds of things need to be looked at. I think the NERC standards need to be looked at because it does tie to the grid, and I don't see where exemptions and those requirements are correct. Rate reductions, in some cases you get a rate reduction, but you get the LMP when you're generating, even though it's not an emergency. So if you look at those things, there's an economic issue there that needs to be resolved. So there's other things, generation saturation. There's standards for that in each of the ISOs to make sure that you don't overbuild generation per the demand. These behind the meter generators, at this point may not have to comply with any of those. And then the ultimate thing is to make sure when they're tied to the grid that they don't become a reliability issue. Go back to the NERC standards, that something that's been done in the private sector doesn't impact the reliability of the grid. So overall, I'll start off with what I said in the beginning. I think it's good. It's good for the consumer. It's definitely good in emergency situations where hospitals and gas stations and supermarkets can probably, when the grid is totally impacted. I see a lot of value in that. But when you get into the normal business piece, I think people have to look at the playing field and make sure that from a business perspective it's on an even playing field.
I would, this is Frank Wszelaki, I'd agree with Richard. What I've seen, and in our area of the industry, we link demand response, we call it demand management, and we link it with energy efficiency. And then when you go back and look at the potential generator, let's say household, that could tie into your systems, you got to understand what those mean. A lot of the larger, though, because we're looking at large LNG growth, in British Columbia, and then also in Washington and in Idaho. It's direct drive. They get away from the mandatory reliability standards. They get away from a lot of the regulations that they'd have to deal with. So financially, a lot of the utilities that are out there that want to provide electricity, you got to really know what the other private firms are doing, like Chevron or Shell, and see what they really need, because you're talking some pretty large 500,000 megawatt load generators, and electricity is electricity. If you can run it to them with a transmission line, it'd be great. But then when you got to deal with all the other stuff, it makes it a little bit more interesting. So as we look at demand response, you might not have a demand response if your large industrials decide that they're going to go island because it's cheaper. Mm-hmm. And they do things on economics, total economics, and it's fast. I tell you, it's really fast. So just got to be careful with that as you look at your transmission line and your responses that you have to make.
John?
In Michigan, I already talked about our energy efficiency profile. We do think we have a good 10-year runway of projects to do yet, at least, and so we're planning to go down the path of heavily encouraging that. Demand response, that recent court ruling kind of seems to indicate that it should be more of a state issue than a federal issue, and so I think there's going to be a lot of states that are thinking about that and wonder if they should be doing more in the area. We currently have utility-run demand response programs, and I know in other states there's third-party run programs, and that's been proposed in Michigan from time to time. But we haven't gone down that path. But I think it's just like energy efficiency, it's a great way to potentially avoid building more generation than you need to, when you can have reduce the peaks or spread out into multiple smaller peaks. What might be one large peak.
Jordan?
So I just want to share a quick story. Is back in January, I was at a forum in West Virginia University. Senator Manchin was there, and a number of folks were coming out to speak about the industry. And there was a representative from Appalachia Public Power, which is part of American Electric Power. They have some of the cheapest electricity in the country, and in their particular region, they also have one of the lowest per capita incomes in the country as well. And they mentioned that on the side of energy efficiency, it doesn't do a lot of good, even if you have state plans that try to incentivize it by providing tax credits or some type of incentive to the families, because they just simply can't afford it. If you want them to buy more efficient appliances, well, it doesn't do a whole lot of good. So you really have to kind of take into account the demographics of your area. And then they were getting more concerned because some of these new regulations, they're concerned that the electricity prices would actually go up. And if you have plant retirements and you lose some jobs, then you're putting even more of a strain on some of the local communities. So I think it's just something we need to keep in mind, is that at the end of the day, it comes down to the consumer and what they can do. We can have the best products in the world, but if they're too expensive, it doesn't really do a lot of good.
Jerry?
Yeah, just to give the environmental perspective quickly, I think it's going to be interesting to see how your state DEPs are going to and the EPA are going to handle demand response, because a lot of these are just essentially just backup diesel generators or backup spark ignited engines and so forth, put in commercially or industrially, and certainly would impact the grid depending on whether they have a automatic transfer switch and so forth. May even be a safety thing, just depends. But environmentally, it's a quagmire in my mind, because of the regulations that came out under the reciprocating internal combustion engine, better known as RICE and RICE-MACT and RICE-NESHAP. And I know maybe not all of you have all those terms in mind, but essentially what it means is that the consumer, the industry, the residential person, commercial operator, they have to choose one of two paths. One is either to peak shave or buy a new engine, right? Buy a new engine that meets the standards past 2009, and head down the road of either emergency backup only, which means limited use, or to peak shave and then put on the environmental controls. Okay, well, let's think about this a second, just walking down the road with me. Impromptuly, I haven't thought about this very much, but if you sign those up for demand response, say for an RTO, you know, you have to step through this very systematically as to the number of hours you can operate. And then you have to decide whether if you're going to operate more than that and how the RTO rules with demand response, how you can respond with your generator. If you think you're going to go over those hours, then you may have to re-permit the units. So it's an interesting business plan. I just caution any of those in the audience to make sure that you do this in a diligent fashion and not find yourself in enforcement. So the two paths are backup power, demand response, and limited hours, or peak shaving, and re-permit it and possibly add environmental controls and step through that. So really my comments are more from a permitting standpoint and some hopefully some comments that will help you sort that out.
Still willing to take a question? We have our first volunteer.
Tom Tarka from the National Energy Technology Laboratory. Due to some of the uncertainties we're talking about in terms of timeline, coal retirements, is skilled labor available for building new gas-fired capacity, pipelines, transmission? This would seem to point to a potential business model for keeping some of those coal units that might otherwise retire in the mix, and maybe price effects are going to go up, capacity markets are going to respond, but this is at odds with the ESPS regulations and the state targets. So is there a potential for this to create new markets for emissions reductions technologies? Or first off, is there a potential for these units to stay in the mix? Will it create new markets for out-of-the-box solutions that aren't CCS, whether that's renewable integration or otherwise? And then I guess a second question, and this speaks to something that Quin mentioned, are there new opportunities for market opportunities for IOUs? Is there a way they can go more into CHP or other services that would allow them that would be profitable in some way to bring up their margins?
There's a 1A and B and a second question.
Well, I'll mention just one small thing to watch in the future is the ruling on how EPA treats biomass. It was actually, they sidestepped the issue completely in the 111D regulation. A number of folks were wondering if you could just co-fire biomass and could you get credit for the emission reductions, and EPA said, we'll wait until we do a ruling on that. So potentially that might be a way to do some biomass co-firing in the future, depending on how they come down on that. The other thing to watch is just looking at power prices and this is me just speaking as a person working at DOE and not an industry person per se, but watching the electricity prices in different regions. Some areas might be able to make a stronger business case if electricity prices go up to be able to keep their assets around. Certainly if you look at EPA's modeling, they're showing another 70 gigawatts according to the impact analysis, which we all know is, take it with a substantial grain of salt. They're showing about 195 gigawatts of remaining remaining coal capacity post 2030. So there are going to be some regions that will need it. I mean, if you just look at polar vortex, which everyone likes to talk about, with gas prices going sky high the way they were, there might be some situations where you could have a plant that just sticks around for those peak times. Traditionally, peak times were coming in the summer, but now we might be seeing some regions where peak times come in the winter. So that could be, it really just depends on what the market does, who retires, who stays on. So it's kind of a poker game right now, watching who's holding the cards, who's going to retire, who's not, and that could really swing financial decisions for a number of folks.
Nobody else is going to take a swing at that one? Or those? All right, well then I will let that pass, and you can certainly chase them down at lunch and afterwards and try and beat an answer out of the rest of them if they're willing to give it to you. The topic of CCS, please do.
Hi, Nick Evans here from Moptech. Probably gathered by my accent, I'm fairly new to the US market. I'm trying to gather all the acronyms and different things being used. But one thing's fairly clear is it's kind of similar to the way Europe's gone to some degree. There's been absolutely loads of different regulations for different types of emissions control, environmental permits, all these kind of things put on top of each other. But what's happened is the latest one that seems to have happened in the US in terms of the clean power is actually impacting coal plants the most. So my question really is about, you've got the MATs, you've got the CASPA, you've got the clean power, you've got timeframes for all of those to actually be met much sooner than the decisions on the clean power are going to be made. So are you going to be having to make some judgment calls on the retirement of your coal plants or on the emissions reductions of your coal plants earlier than the clarity of the clean power legislation?
I think the question is will we have to make judgment calls earlier than seeing what the court decisions are? Is that the question? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that my CEO and COO and I talk about on occasion, frequent occasion with legal counsel. And the fact is that, and I think you're hitting a very good point in the fact that what happens is like June 2nd, the Clean Power Plan comes out, and then it just influences the industry immediately. And the power of that influence is very large. It also gives clear direction as to where the U.S. may be going since it's proposed, but then when it goes final, then it is going. So if the question is, does that heavily influence us? Yes, as an industry. The other thing is that our top management executives and board then start to look at this and identify the impacts to the system, the customers, and so forth, and make different decisions, possibly make different decisions for our future, well ahead of the court rulings, because essentially in 2020, and I haven't seen this said today, is that you will be complying. Most people are looking at this as, okay, 2029, I got a lot of time. No, you'll already have made some decisions, baby steps, to start complying in 2020, because that's a 10-year average. That's a 10-year average. And so when you talk about the 4 building blocks, 6% heat rate improvement, some thoughts are right now is that you'll just be running your coal plant 6% less, because a lot of the heat rate improvements have already been made. And I have 13 and a half years in power plants, and the fact that I'd like to see somebody raise their hands and show us how to get a 6% heat rate improvement. General Electric says 1 to 2% is a huge deal. So one industry truth could be you're going to be running less, right? And then the other building blocks, all the rest of the 3 of them are telling you to redispatch natural gas combined cycle, redispatch low emitters, and so forth. And to answer your question and close it up real quick is that absolutely the power of the pen is mightier than the sword. And the power of influence makes all of these power companies, including ours, start to tweak our thinking in a different direction.
Rich, I think Quinn was
Yeah, I think I understand your question.
going to go next.
If I'm going the wrong way, stop me, okay? But we've already made decisions based on the economics of coal versus gas. As I told you before, we have a fuel-diverse fleet, and our 3 coal plants do burn 2 types of fuel. 2 of them burn coal and gas. 1 of them burns coal and oil. The ones that burn coal and gas, we've already, almost a year ago, have made a decision to try to figure out when the shoulder months were going to be when coal wouldn't operate. And we actually take the labor off the site and redistribute that labor to another part of the company by bring down the EBITDA, which is the cash that comes in, so that we don't use as much O&M when we're burning gas, because you don't need all those extra people. It's about 50 extra people. So we've done that for the past year now, and we turned some EBITDAs that were red, we turned them black, and we're keeping the coal plants alive. My CEO says as long as the cash is coming in, I'll take a good look at them and keep going. So there's issues relative to the economics that we've had to make some forward decisions. The other thing is we spent $1.5 billion putting back in technology into 3 plants. 2 of them have full available technologies for NOx, sulfur, particulate, and mercury. One of them has a filter for particulate and mercury, but we use a fuel that's low NOx and low sulfur. So we're doing these things in advance to keep the coal viable. We do believe that, like the polar vortex, coal was definitely a part of keeping the lights on last winter in New England, Connecticut, and New Jersey. So as long as we can keep it going economically, I think it'll survive. If it can't survive economically, it'll go away.
Quinn?
I think the last 2 answers were spot on. They were perfect. And let me just add one footnote, which actually points out, I think, the delta and the catch-22 that exists between the last 2 questions. Because there is a bit of conundrum right now. There are a number of plants over the next couple of years that are getting shuttered no matter what, partly because they're uneconomical, partly because of the MATS rule. That's going to happen. But there's a handful of tweener plants that are slated to be shut. But having looked at the lesson of last winter, there's some discussion, some serious discussion going on as to whether those, I don't know, mothball may not be the right word, whether they need to be kept just in case. Of course, the problem with that is that that doesn't match up with the glide path for 111D. And that's a serious problem. Excellent point was made. We fought like hell pre-proposal to get a 2030 deadline that mattered, where there was a gradual slope between 2020 and 2030, so that those 10 years would have meaning. The problem is, this is correct, this is front-loaded. When you're looking at 2-year rolling averages over that 10-year window, you can't, the delta between 2020 and 2030 is not that much. So the conundrum then is, we have these plants we might want to keep open for reliability purposes, but now we're also looking at, do we have to accelerate the curve that we thought we were on between now and 2020 just to make it relative to 111D. That puts a premium on getting some changes to the 111D rules so that we can make sense of the MATS and 111D timelines. It's a problem.
Question over here.
I just want to make the conversation a little bit more serious by interjecting some of the Clean Water Act implications here. It's more of an observation, and I'd be interested in your reactions. But one thing we're seeing at Exelon, I mean, we're talking about, transmission, we're talking about renewables, we're talking about energy efficiency. Well, there's going to be an impact, potentially an impact under this Waters of the U.S. proposed rule. It's going to make it infinitely more difficult, expensive and complex to get permitted large transmission projects. We even see an impact in new distribution systems, even stringing fiber optic cable for smart grid. And when you talk to the EPA about this, the water program, they're saying, well, we're not expanding the rule, we're just clarifying it. And we say, yeah, but what about all these implications? And they say, well, there's no implications, because this is what the answer was and should have been all along, that these are jurisdictional waters and they should be regulated as such. Any thoughts about where that kind of issue arises, if any of you have sort of taken a look that far ahead?
I'll start, and amen, brother. And for the record, this gentleman right here put in a lot of good work in that 11th hour is talking about to fix the 316B rule. So thank you. Waters of the U.S. I think I made my disdain for this rule well known. But yes, we're at a point right now. EPA is completely wrong, and I think this has factored in the political backlash they've received on the Hill, both sides of the aisle, and from the states is telling, and that's why we've got that multi-month extension. The fact of the matter is, for many years, EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers were working with folks on the Hill, Oberstar, good example, to get legislation passed, basically clarifying the Clean Water Act in a way that would provide them the latitude they're looking for through this rule. Didn't get any takers, even among the Democrats, to move forward with that kind of legislation. Then EPA said, well, maybe we'll do it through guidance. They were quickly told, no, this is a matter of gravity. You can't do this through guidance. This has to be legislation or a rule. So they moved forward with the rule. Fact is, they are expanding the definition of the Clean Water Act. Fact is, anything that we do, and I was interesting about the fiber optics, anything in the transmission, generation, or distributed generation space, anything that we do on almost any half-acre plot where something that we're doing touches the ground is potentially susceptible to what I call this energy zoning rule. So huge deal. I think I was pretty strong in my view that you need to watch that one. It's a sleeper issue. And if it goes sideways, it could be up there with MATS and 316B and 111D. I can't say anything more than that, Bill.
I was just going to chime in from a standpoint of where the British Columbia is at. There was a Columbia River Treaty signed in the 60s between the U.S. and the United States, and the reason was for flood control, and the co-benefit was the generation of electricity. That's where the dams are built and generation is created. One of the largest ones, Hugh Keelyside Dam, and Grand Coulee. The reason I bring that up is as both countries are now into the negotiation, because we're in that treaty termination or modification time period, is Quinn brought it up, and you, sir, you brought it up too, the water. Take water beyond just energy. It's recreational, and it's fisheries and irrigation. And what we're seeing is, as our negotiations are going on, and yes, I'm a U.S. citizen, but I do work in Canada, it's rather interesting to watch now how the benefit of electricity is being weighed against the environmental side of how you affect the usage of water. So I think that's going to play a big part in the future as you see things moving on, especially as you see the, Lake Mead, lowest water levels it's seen in ever, and water is going to be a very commodity people are going to really want. So it's going to be interesting to see how water and energy move itself forward. So I just wanted to bring that up. Yep.
Well, just one thing to make sure everybody in the audience understands this, is that what they're talking about is a dry ditch that leads to a river, okay? And economically speaking, in Kentucky, that's $210 a foot if you talk to the Louisville district. So whether it's a perennial stream, which we all know what those are, in the old days they were called blue line streams, we get that, but a dry ditch can be the next one, and that's the ephemeral stream. So it is very expensive. It's not to be taken lightly. It will shock you. If Clark County High School, they were building a new high school in Clark County, they had a real shock when they found out they owed the Corps $250,000. Now that may not sound like a large sum in here, but when it's $3 million, $250,000 was a big wake-up call. So waters of the U.S. are essentially on your property. You will have to deal with it. You'll have to mitigate it, whether through engineering methods and biological ways, or you'll have to pay them an in-lieu fee. It's a big deal. And siting transmission, oh my goodness. Depending on how they apply the rules with the Clean Water Act, you may even be putting in outfalls. I don't know if you heard me or not, but you may be putting in outfalls for every so many miles to account for this. So it's not to be taken lightly. I hope that helps.
Not lightly, but the list of exclusions from this at EPA, they went to great pains to say your backyard swimming pool will not be considered a water of the U.S., but it's not clear what else won't be.
And we're time for one last question.
My understanding is with the new rule that there is also provision that potentially affects modified or reconstructed units. So I was wondering if you guys could maybe comment on what the impact of that is. I don't know if that goes back to the 111B in terms of new units, but how that part of the rule may affect what happens in terms of what's going forward with 111D.
So I'll offer 2 points on that. So first, on the modified sources, EPA was concerned that if you had an existing plant that you could grandfather it in forever, modify 99% of the plant and then get your existing permit, so that you could essentially go out and build a whole new plant, call it modified, and then you wouldn't have to comply with the new source limits. So that's one reason why they did it. So that was part of their concern. But the other major reason they did it is kind of a legal reason. So if you look at 111D and you look at the regulation, they require that you have a 111B regulation as a precursor. So you have to regulate, well, most people think you have to regulate new plants before you regulate existing plants, which is technically true. But as long as you have some 111B regulation as a precursor, then your 111D is good. So EPA is keenly aware that there's likely going to be a legal challenge on 111B for the new plants, and if that gets thrown out, well, normally you would have 111D also get thrown out because there's no precursor. With the modified source rule, they have two precursors to the 111D, so they have two things that would need to get thrown out before 111D. So that's the other big reason that they've got these kind of two failure modes that you need to get through it.
Nobody else wants to chime in? That's okay. Jerry, you're welcome to if you'd like.
Essentially, what that does is, if you thought that you're going to convert one of these mass retired old coal plants to a natural gas combined cycle, you may ought to read that rule. That's what that means.
All right, that was a very succinct answer. With that, I would ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for their participation this morning. Lunch will now be served upstairs, same place you got your coffee and snacks earlier. We will be back here at 1:30 for our next panel, so you've got about an hour to enjoy your lunch, and so we will see you back in 1 hour. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you got a lot of-
This is terrific.